Do we really have a caste census? Did we ever have a caste census? I think this nomenclature itself is a misnomer of sorts, because even the recently concluded Bihar caste survey was basically a survey of not only caste but also other socioeconomic characteristics like landholding, education, and other indicators. So there is not really a caste census per se that has ever happened in India or is going to happen. It either has to be part of the larger census that happens. In fact, the 2011 census conducted and included some data on caste, and it was more appropriately called the socioeconomic and caste census, SECC. The data was never released. That's another matter. And I would say I would begin by saying that it's precisely because the caste census, whatever it means, collects data on more than caste identities, just counting people and who belongs to what caste. It's precisely because it goes beyond that, it's such a politicized and a very, very controversial topic. If it only counted the numbers of people belonging to certain caste, then it would not be as controversial as it is today. The second thing that I want to highlight also is the entire aspect of history. This is not the first time that we are discussing about caste census. Caste censuses have happened in 100 years ago, in 1911, 1921, 1931. And that was the last time we had a nationwide caste census. Now, if you read Dr. Ambedkar's writings, many of his writings, but especially highlighting one very important text, Untouchables of the Children of India's Ghettos. He refers to the 1911 census and 1921 census, and he makes an argument that without those numbers, the entire issue of depressed classes, as the Dalits or the scheduled castes were known then, would not have been, again, as controversial, as politicized as it then became. Because it was those numbers that were the most controversial when it came to the Lothian Commission, when it came to the roundtable conferences. And so, how much is the population of the, as we know now, scheduled caste or Dalits, became the main focus of the controversy in many of these negotiations that were happening. In fact, if you think about it, in a, maybe not in a direct sense, but in an indirect sense, what we have right now in the Constitution of India, some sort of a structure of affirmative action, even that came out of the assertion, conflict, negotiation that took place around those numbers that came out from the census of 1911, 1921, and 1931. It was those numbers that became again a matter of controversy under the Pune Pact, and then later gave rise to the 1935 Government of India Act, and then later the Constitution of India. So that's also something that we have to think about. The third, coming to the more contemporary reason why we are here and why the caste census has become something that we are talking about, is the recent data from the Bihar survey. Again, the Bihar caste census was not called caste census because of a legal problem that only the national governments can conduct the census. The Bihar government did not have the legal standing to conduct the census, so it was called a socioeconomic survey. So, again, I think nomenclature is really, really important. Now, what did come out of the data? If you add the population of the scheduled caste and the scheduled tribes and the other backward classes, including the extremely backward classes known as EBCs, and if you put all those numbers together, you get the figure of 84.5, which is again very close to the figure of 85%, something that we have been hearing in many social justice slogans for a long, long time. 100 में 85 भाग हमारा, and many such slogans. So, I mean, if you think about it, it should not come as a surprise that these numbers were so close. 85% was the claim that this was the share of the population for people belonging to SC, ST, and OBC sections of the population, and the final number was 84.5%. It was so close. I mean, so if you are a serious student of society in India, it should not come as a surprise. But it is also, again, I'm going back to the first point, it is so controversial because it is not only that, it also tells you data about who owns land, how much they own land. So if somehow it becomes apparent to the policymakers, the opinion makers, and also the people at large, that it is a tiny section of the population that may control a large section of the resources, it is then that it becomes very, very controversial that way. And the final point I think I would make and then give it over to Professor Deshpande is about this entire link between caste and development. In the mainstream liberal discourse, caste has often been thought as standing against development. Now, if you think about it, even if you believe in that caste is something that is standing against development, I think a caste census would still be advisable because then, as Professor Deshpande has written in many of his writings, a caste census will give us, the Indian society, a collective selfie. This is not my term, this is coming from Professor Deshpande. A collective selfie. We will all come to know where we stand and together, how we are faring. And that will still be a desirable goal for our national developmental goals and whatever. But even then, I don't think that is something that is happening around us. We know that this is a highly, highly controversial theme. And that is again, that takes me to another theme that Professor Deshpande has worked and has been writing about it for a long time. This idea of the caste elite seeing themselves as casteless. And this idea that since there is no caste, what is the need for a caste census? And because the caste elite believes that they don't belong to a caste, so there is no caste and there is no need for a caste census. And I think Professor Deshpande will surely talk about it in some detail here. And the final thing is, I often wonder, actually, this is something that I have not really found out about, but my hunch is there any other country where censuses lead to such kind of controversies? I mean, in the US, for example, I just, when I was preparing this very small note, I Googled and I tried to find out, is it controversial to have racial population figures in the US census? It is not. I mean, it's a regular activity in many other countries to identify and estimate the share of different sections of the population based on their cultural, ethnic, and other markers. And so, it's a food for thought for all of us. Why is it that a regular exercise like a census and a caste census have become such a controversial thing in our society? And that is where I think some of these questions will be perhaps taken up by Professor Deshpande. And finally, I would just want to say one or two minor things. Again, the government of India recently appointed a commission called the Rohini Commission. And there is a demand from many parts of the country about subcategorization of the OBC category into separate subcategories. And this commission was appointed, and the commission has now submitted its report. Now, I again wonder, how would you really subcategorize the OBCs into different categories like EBCs or NBCs without having caste numbers? So, if on the one hand you want to do this as a political project, on the other hand you really don't have the numbers, and there is also does not seem to be an intention to even go in the direction of the caste census. And finally, I just thought I should end with a joke. I mean, not a joke, but something like, we don't even have the census numbers now. So we don't even have the 2021 census, and I don't know when this is going to happen. So maybe you were asking for suggestions for next activity. We can have a next talk and a discussion about, do we need a national census at all, right? So yeah, with that, I think I end and invite Professor Deshpande for his talk. Thank you very much.
much. I'd like to thank Bangalore Collective and St. Joseph's College for this opportunity to speak. I believe the disease has not spread here, but in Delhi we are in the grip of not quite an epidemic, but it's getting there, of being disinvited. Being invited to an event and then being disinvited. And I'm very glad that I was invited and remained invited. Nothing happened to disrupt that. So I'm doubly thankful to actually be able to speak here. And I'm very grateful to all of you to come at this somewhat odd time, braving the Bangalore traffic, to listen to somebody speak about something like the caste census. So I have been given a question to answer. It's in front of you. Will a caste census? We take the inverted commas for granted. I know there are lawyers present, but please don't sue me if I use the caste census as a common language term without worrying about jurisdiction, who has the right, and so on. Will a caste census deliver social justice? It's a question worth thinking about, but I have to tell you that I won't answer that question. What I will do is try and speculate with you, think with you about what it means to look for an answer to this question. What would an answer look like? How would we recognize it? How would we examine it? Right? So that's what I'm going to do. If we are trying to link something called a caste census to something called social justice, what might the links be? This is what I'm going to be exploring with you today. So I hope it's now 4:36. 4:37 by my watch. I try to keep this to 35 to 40 minutes and then hope that we can have a discussion, question answer session. Because for a topic like this, question answers are far more important than what I might have to say here. So let's start our exploration with unpacking or looking at the two important terms here, obvious terms, caste census and social justice. That's what we'll start with. So, as Amish has already made clear, by caste census, we don't mean a counting of heads and therefore coming up with population numbers for castes alone. That in itself would be a terrible thing to do and a very retrograde step. It is when the information on numbers of castes is associated with other socioeconomic data that this becomes important and relevant. And in my opinion, necessary for our country today. So, if that's what we mean by caste census, and I should also add, I am including in the term caste census the assumption that this data will actually be made public, that it will be published and made public. We have had caste censuses of different kinds at different levels after 1931. It's not true that we have not had. But these have never been published until the publication of the Bihar caste census in inverted commas. The SECC, which was mentioned, the 2011 exercise, was a planned failure, so it never saw light of day. Where we stand now, my own state of Karnataka has performed the survey, but has not released the results, and you see speculation almost every day in the press as to, at least the local press, as to what is going to happen with this. The state of Tamil Nadu conducted such a comprehensive thing sometime in the past, again never released. In fact, it didn't even announce that it was going through this exercise. And so, when I say caste census, I'm assuming that a census with the data made public. That's very important. Right? Just the act of conducting a census is very different, whether the results are made public or not made public. So you will already see what I'm trying to get at here, which it's a theme I will return to after spending a little bit of time on the other term, social justice. What I'm talking about is, for want of a better term right now, I'm using the phrase awareness of number. A caste census, a census of any kind, and in this case we happen to be talking about a caste census, in modern times brings with it a certain special awareness of number. And this awareness of number is a social thing. It's a social force in its own right. And especially in a media-saturated society like ours now, the coming of social media has only intensified this saturation and taken it to an even deeper, granular level. In such a society, awareness of number is in itself a force of a certain kind. And that's the force I want to talk about. But I'll come to that later. Let's go to our other term here, social justice. Once again, it's a term that might lead you to think that we all know what it is, right? And in the context of caste, by social justice, we might mean, let me simply, for the sake of brevity, let me simply mark out two extremes, and we will assume that everything in between belongs to that spectrum. On the minimalist extreme of social justice, we have the hope or the expectation that the present inequalities and injustices that mark the relationships between particular groups called castes, that these inequalities and injustices will be reduced to some degree. That's a minimalist expectation with regard to social justice. At the other end of the spectrum of the same term, social justice, we have, of course, Baba Sahib's passionate term, the annihilation of caste. So the maximum we can expect along the social justice spectrum is something called the annihilation of caste. Now I want to spend a few minutes talking about this because it's a passionate term, because it works very well in public politics, because it is designed almost to be a slogan. It deflects detailed scrutiny. Right? Anyone who wants to ask what the annihilation of caste is thought of as somebody who's not with it. Right? You don't understand what social justice is about and so on. But I think we need to spend time on it, because remember that this term comes from 1935. Right? Close to a century, we're getting there a century ago. More importantly, please remember that it comes from what I would like to call now as a pre-electoral time. The first significant elections of any kind in India happened in, I think, 1936 or 1937, when the provincial governments were formed. That too was a limited election, but it was an election. This is 1935. So, the meaning of the annihilation of caste, I would submit, has been transformed by electoral politics, and especially by electoral politics of the last 20-25 years. So what we might mean by the term annihilation of caste today is considerably less clear than perhaps it was in 1935. So, just to be provocative, let me just put it out there. We can talk more about it in question and answer. I think today we don't know. In fact, probably we can't know what the annihilation of caste might mean. This need not mean that we are, the struggle for social justice is blocked in some way or they cannot proceed. What I mean to say is that the idea of the annihilation of caste will not bear investigation today, given that we live in the times that we live in, given what has happened to caste identities and given the role that caste identities play in a variety of facets of public life, including, very importantly, elections. So I don't believe that the term is useful in the old sense anymore. I think it should serve as a placeholder for the maximum that we can expect today in terms of the alleviation of caste injustice. So let's keep that in mind. I'll return to this theme. This is related also to what I spoke earlier about in terms of awareness of number. So where are we right now? We have looked at the term social justice, we have looked at the term census, and we have a preliminary sense of what the spread of meaning that these might involve. Let me come now to my central theme, which is what I want to speak to you about. And I'm going to disappoint you if you were expecting from me the two most immediate results that people think of, or at least the media speculates of, as to what will happen if a caste census actually happens. A, there is talk of data becoming available, which will make the delivery of social justice programs or welfare programs, more accurately, which will improve them in some way. Now, that might happen, that might not happen. I personally am not very convinced either way. I'm willing to listen to arguments both ways, that it's true that the absence of data has been a problem in some respects with the refinement and further expansion of social justice programs. But the main thing blocking our social welfare programs has not been the lack of information. As Avnish was pointing out earlier, even the Bihar caste census, the only census in independent India that has actually been published on the subject of caste, did not yield any major surprises. So we know this data. In a sense, we know that, at least we have known since the 1990s, that the so-called upper castes are a minority. Before that, yes, maybe we knew it in an arithmetic sense, we did not know it in a political sense. Since the 1990s, we know, and especially in the 21st century, we know in a political sense that the upper castes are a minority. And in fact, the contemporary politics is unraveling, is working out the implications of that political knowledge that the upper castes are a minority. Right? So, if the census is actually not going to yield, make us privy to secret knowledge that we did not have before, why is it so important? It's important, I believe, because of this thing I'm calling, once again, it's for want of a better term. I'm sure someone will come up with a very sexy term for it soon, and we will see it used in the media and so on. But right now I'm using this rather, shapeless bag for it, called awareness of number. Now, many social scientists have spoken of this already, and probably the most famous, relatively recent example is the late political scientist Benedict Anderson, and his use of the term imagined communities, where it's not so much the phrase itself. We knew that communities were imagined. The important thing that Anderson did, particularly from the point of view of social science, the practice of social science, the important thing he did was to focus our attention on the mechanisms, the methods, the means through which communities come to be imagined. So he focused our attention on what we might fashionably today call the technologies by which communities are imagined. And of these technologies, the census is a very important part. As Anderson himself recognized, the daily newspaper, the coming of the modern novel, printing in general, etc. So you're familiar with this. It's a very well-known word, so I won't belabor the point. So awareness of number has a peculiar kind of synergistic effect in modern society, that it helps to crystallize identities. Not just to crystallize identities, it helps to yoke these identities to political programs in a particular way. despite not giving us something, giving us news that we had no idea about, right? Despite not revealing any secret to us. Somehow, the act of a census, for various reasons, some of which was hinted at by Amish, the lawyers among you might be aware of this piece of legislation called the Indian Census Act 1948. The social scientists will perhaps be less aware that the census is the only quasi-social scientific investigation where you can compel your respondents to answer. You know, social scientists dream of being able to conduct surveys where you can tell people, if you don't answer this questionnaire, which is going to take you 2.5 hours, if you don't answer it, you'll go to jail. But the Census Act literally says that you will go to jail. If you refuse to answer the census enumerator's questions, you can face prison, right? And a fine, or a fine. Right? Similarly, if the information collected under the census is exempted from the Indian Evidence Act. So if for some reason, as part of a census investigation, I were to reveal something that would be incriminating, it cannot be used against me in a court of law. It cannot be used as evidence against me in a court of law. Finally, if a census official reveals census data, officials are also subject to imprisonment. So I'm only pointing all this out to say that the census is a very important kind of an investigation. Its being universal is only one aspect of it. It carries the full backing of the state. So, if an investigation on caste is done through this mechanism, the kind of awareness of number it will produce is, to my mind, is going to be on a different scale and qualitatively different also from the impact that some other survey might have. And social media in particular, the world of social media, to which I am mostly a stranger, has introduced a new kind of legitimacy by number. The number of times something is retweeted or forwarded today offers a certain kind of legitimacy to otherwise bizarre beliefs that in other times we might, any reasonable person would have dismissed out of hand. But today I have well-meaning, good people, intelligent people telling me seriously, but it has been retweeted 375,000 times. And similarly, we have likes, we have followers. We know very well that some of our leaders have large numbers of quote-unquote followers. Here I'm saying followers not in the traditional sense of people who will literally follow you as in the Gandhi March, but people who follow you on social media, right? So in this era, where number and its political mobilization have taken on a new grammar, a new potency of its own, what would awareness of number mean in this context? This is the question I want to spend some time on. Here, let me take a step back from the immediate issues here to place before you two abstract constructs. I want you to think about the relationship between two kinds of axes, if you like. One, and I'm deliberately putting them very sharply and very crudely, very bluntly, so to speak. One axis is the axis between good and bad, or if you prefer, good and less good. That's one axis. And the other axis is more and less, the many and the few. Right? Now think about in our social life how these two axes are related in different contexts. And I will mention only two contexts. The most obvious context is that of the modern election of the type we have, political election of the type we have in India, the first past the post system, where the many are better than, there is more good on the side of the many than there is on the side of the few. we consider it legitimate that if I poll less votes than Avnish must win the election and I must lose the election. We believe that this is right. So more is better. That might not make me a bad person or make me bad in that sense, but it definitely makes me less good. It makes me less good in a consensual sense, broadly consensual sense, right? Think of the very different context, and I'm in an educational institution here, so we will immediately relate to this. This is a word that is haunting educational institutions today, the word called excellence. Now think of what excellence does and how it relates the many and the few and the good and the bad. Our habits of thought about thinking about excellence compel us to think that excellence and the many cannot go together. That excellence must belong to the few. And the holiest institution of modern India, no, it's not the cow, and no, it's not the mobile phone, it's the examination. In India, we worship examinations. And examinations are devices, coercive devices, to produce a ranking, to separate a few from the many. And we believe in them. We believe in them more than in any other religion we believe in. So, once again, a conceptual sense in which the good are always the few, and the many cannot be the good. Right? This is the model of a running race, where a race where everyone comes first is treated as a failure. Right? You just have it all over again. Right? So our examinations are designed to produce third decimal place differences, bowing to the god of merit, hierarchy, whatever you call it. I just wanted to flag these two. So what I'm saying is that the relationship between the many and the good, or between the few and the good for that matter, is not a rule. It's not natural. It's not given to us. We construct it. We construct it socially. If that is so, then how does this awareness of number that a caste census might bring, what will it do to us, to our political sensibilities? That's the question that's really at the heart of, in my mind, that is what is at the heart of the question we are dealing with today. So, in my opinion, the question we are asking, or this meeting is asking, amounts to it forces us to reflect on the relationship between the many and the few, and the good and the less good, or the good and the bad. So, let us think in conclusion about what might happen with the caste census. We are already aware of the dangers of majoritarianism in one context. I don't need to say more about this. Right? And we are aware of majoritarianism within a framework of what is being called electocracy. That is to say, a democracy where the only thing democratic about it are the elections. And once the elections are over, it can move into an authoritarian mode, backed by the legitimacy of the election. So, you win 30-something% of the valid votes, and you have the mandate of the majority. And this electoral majority can be seamlessly translated into all kinds of moral majorities, political majorities, ethical majorities, where the first past the post gets translated into winner takes all in political terms. So, in today's context, there is no room to speak of minority rights, where discussion of this question itself is framed in such a way that real discussion on it is not possible. remember that minorities need not only be in religious terms. Minority in Indian English has become a term for minority religions, and today it sometimes is used as code for Muslims. But we know that the word minority need not only mean this, right? It can mean any group that is few relative to some other group. Remember, we are not talking absolutes. We are a country of 140 crores, so even a very small proportion yields a very large absolute number. So we are not talking about small numbers in that sense. If we are aware of this, then we have to think about what is it that we expect, or rather, to put it more broadly and perhaps more hopefully, what is it that we can reasonably expect, and what should we be wary of or alert about when we talk about a caste census? On the one hand, the fact that India's best kept public secret since the 1990s has become a part of our political sphere, namely the secret that the upper castes are a minority. Notice how the term minority operates in the caste context and how it operates in the religious context. It is today undeniable that the upper castes are a minority, but when we talk about them, we hardly ever talk about them in the national political context. But when we do talk about them, we don't talk about them as though they were a minority. Right? The lower castes are taken together are a majority, vast majority in fact, in this country. But we don't talk about them as a majority, in the sense that we talk about majority in other contexts. This is human made. There's nothing natural about these terms that forces us to think differently in this context and differently in that context. We are complicit in these shifts of meaning. Right? So, if electoral logic is always tilted in favor of the many, and if the census is an act of counting and aggregation, it also presumably will be tilted on the side of the many. So while on the one hand, we can put moral pressure on the upper castes by making public through a census their minority status. On the other hand, what will we do to caste groups that are thought of as being many? This is a question we need to think about seriously. Because the one solution that is not given to us by this framework, the counting framework, the census framework, doesn't tell us what will happen to small numbers. There is no logic within the census logic that leads us in any particular political direction about smaller numbers. So, being small in India, as I said, is a matter of proportion. It's not a question of absolutes, because absolute numbers will be very large. Can we afford to have the claims of certain caste groups to be toned down in some way, merely because they are smaller in number? On the one hand, the upper castes might use that argument to say, so what if we are only 15%? We are born to rule, and we are the only ones who have the as they say these days, as a euphemism, the bandwidth to rule. Right? They are the only ones smart enough to rule. Implicitly, this is being said all the time. Now, clearly, this is unacceptable. But when we transplant this language to other contexts, what might happen? This is something we need to think about. So, it is now going to be 5 minutes past 5, and I think I shall stop here and wait for your responses. I have only tried to do one thing, and that is to take this question in terms of its not so obvious implications. and invite you to think about the associations we make, the political associations, the moral associations we make between manyness and fewness, and the census being primarily a device to identify manyness and fewness. What are the questions we need to think about if we want our census to do more good than bad, more good than evil for us? On the question of social justice, certainly, but also perhaps on other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Deshpande. I think I have lots of things to ask myself, but also some clarifications about the basic framework that Professor presented here. But before that, the floor is open. If you have any question, any clarification, please. Yeah.
Hello, Professor Satish. Thank you for the talk. I'm Ankita. So I wanted to ask about what you termed as awareness of number. So I feel it's more of a demand, borrowing of words, the arithmetic sense of using the population minorities, because when you have to come to terms with your privileges, and then you also have to go into the question of the myth of the merit. So my question is how do you see the awareness of number in respect to the caste reparative justice as said by Professor Amit Murat from JNU? He has given a talk recently about the case for the Dalit reparations. So how do you see the awareness of this? Because if we consider the reparative justice as the maximalist end of the social justice spectrum, how do you say it? Because then the question comes that who is payable for these reparative justices?
Yeah, I think one or two more questions, and then Professor would like to respond to them together. So, yeah. Yes, please, that.
Thank you for the talk. There were two or three thoughts I had. I don't know if it forms a question or a comment though. First of all, I would want to ask Professor Satish, even when the caste data is not coupled with economic data or social data, will it not serve a very important purpose, especially if we take the context of Karnataka or states like that, wherein there has been an ongoing debate about the number of the caste groups in itself. And will it significantly not shift the politics of significantly shift the politics and the way it's played out, and therefore then start affecting lives of people in very different ways. The example is Lingayat and Mukkaliga caste numbers have been hotly debated for long now. So if we have correct numbers, even without them being coupled with economic data, I think it will have some significant impact, especially when we get the numbers of the subcaste groups. The second contestation, sort of a contestation I had, was that one subcaste data imply very important meanings for us in the whole spectrum of things. Subcaste data. I think it will definitely change the way things are working around. We have, as Professor Satish was saying, we have probable estimates and things like that, but do we have it at the subcaste level is the issue that might be a deciding factor, and if we have legitimate numbers on it, I think it will change. I had one more thing. Annihilation of caste, what does it mean for the day? I think that requires a much more elaborate discussion than what it was presented.
I agree entirely. I was not trying to.
Okay, one last question. Then next round. Yes.
Thank you, Professor Satish. I would just, my question actually links to the first point that he's asked or commented upon. See, as Avnish, Dr. Avnish put it in the beginning, and then you also backed it by saying that caste census is not about just enumerating the heads. It is also about linking it with other socioeconomic variables, and that is what makes it important. Otherwise, it is a retrograde. It may be a retrograde step even. But then, the way you explained, the way I understood your lecture today, where you were looking at the importance of caste census, maybe at least as the importance dwells from awareness of numbers and not to any politics, not to any ideological understanding, but just from the matter of what you call as electrocracy or electoral politics, and the awareness of numbers, how that will play out in electoral politics. If that is the only sort of outcome that one is looking at, then only enumerating heads would also make a logic, and even if it is not linked to the socio-economic variables around it. So I just wanted to get a clarity on it. If the expectation is only limited to electrocracy, as you said, and the awareness of numbers, then even that makes a sense, perhaps.
Okay, I think we'll come back after the professor has responded to these three.
Very.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Right. To start with your question about privileges, merit, reparations, and so on. Firstly, I think we are a long way from reparations still in this country, where even the debate on something called like reservations is never ending. And the institution of the EWS reservation, to my mind, shows that we have slipped back in our understanding of reservation as a form of social justice. So I think there's a long way to go before we come to the reparation stage. Yes, it should be talked about and mentioned. But what I'm interested in is about process and about everyday life in society. Now, if you think of reparation as, well, literally the process, it might take time, right? Like a 5-year plan or whatever. But conceptually, it's a one-off thing. You owe me something and you pay me reparation, and that's the end of the matter. Caste never ends. At least we don't know how it's going. That's why annihilation of caste, we don't know what it might mean today. So if caste is not going to die and end with reparation, then reparation itself will become just another stepping stone on the way, which is not to say that we should not be arguing for reparation. I'm saying two things. One, right now it is too far away on the horizon for us to have a clear sense of political strategy around it. Two, even when that day arrives, we need to think beyond reparations. If it is to suit what caste is, right? So I think reparations will be an incomplete solution to the problem of caste in the way that caste is working out. So that's will pure number not affect politics? Yes, but that's my problem actually. Remember, it says social justice. Beyond the pure arithmetic of it, it's difficult for me to invoke the word justice if pure number is involved. Right? The winning of an election by a simple majority, that is a convention. Would you call it a matter of justice? See, it becomes justice when we say, for example, the scheduled caste, we say they need justice. Do they need justice because they belong to XYZ caste? No, not because of that. They need justice because belonging to XYZ caste means that they are treated in a particular way. And that being treated in a particular way, some of that is reducible to number. Some of it is measurable. And that measurable part we have to address. Wherever that measurable part is available to us, we have to include that in our, that is what justice is. So you're asking for something, not because you belong to XYZ group, but because injustice has been done to you. And the content of that injustice cannot inhere in pure number alone. Right? It has to inhere in other things other than number. So that injustice is injustice, even if it is being done to only one person. And there are 99 others to whom no injustice is being done. Even then, that case of injustice remains a case of injustice. So what I'm saying is that for justice to have any traction, for it to have any grip, it must be more than a sheer head count of XYZ identity. And especially when those identities start to become ambiguous in terms of social oppression, social disadvantage, and so on, things get even murkier. Right? So with Vakaligas and Ligats today, you have to go into disaggregation, which is probably your other point. You have to get into disaggregation before you are able to talk about justice, injustice, and so on. There are segments of the Vakaliga and segments of the Ligat community which cannot demand justice today, because no injustice is being done to them today. Right? And yet there might be parts of that community which can legitimately demand justice. So yes, I am very much for. I have always been for subcaste enumeration, long before it began to be talked about in this time. And if one of the ironies of the history of social justice struggles in this country is that when demands for subcaste categorization come about, exactly the same arguments as are used by the upper castes are used by the dominant sections of the lower castes to stop subcaste enumeration. So these are the ironies we have to fight against. So I really think counting of pure number is retrograde. It will take us in the wrong direction unless we keep in mind that it's justice we are here. We are not talking about majorities. We are talking about justice and injustice. And for that we need more information. And subcaste, I've already said that. Caste is a construction. The fact that we call it a construction doesn't mean that it is fiction in the sense of made up, or it doesn't matter what it is. The fact that it is constructed becomes politically a matter of political negotiation in particular contexts. And that is exactly what we are seeing today. Caste politics today is all about aggregation and disaggregation. And this aggregation and disaggregation of different jati groups has to carry some political conviction, has to persuade, has to carry some legitimacy, political legitimacy. And the making and unmaking of this legitimacy is the game that is going on now. And it needs to go on. I feel that we are evolving, caste politics is evolving in our country, and part of that evolution is a more refined sense of and moving beyond the highest level of constructed categories like the OBC, or for that matter, even the scheduled castes or the scheduled tribes and so on. Or for that matter, the upper castes, the so-called upper castes, right? Like the non-poor, the upper castes have remained unstudied largely in India. And we need to do a lot more to turn the third question, I'm now forgetting exactly. Enumeration and social justice. Can you just remind me again what you...
No, I think more or less what you just said, when you lecture, the sense, I mean, you said that caste census or socioeconomic census, socioeconomic and caste census is important for this sheer fact that it will lead to awareness of numbers, and given that the outcome that I got a sense from was that it is important given the larger political profile of defined by electrocracy. So I'm saying if that is the eventual link that you are trying to draw, where justice or any ideological understanding of social justice is kept apart and it is only awareness of numbers, then in that case even counting the heads will suffice.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. What I meant to say and should have said is that the contingency of the relationship between number and political power, this contingency is a deeply political thing. Right? It is produced at a particular moment through the work of people who are working in politics, through the work of whom we call politicians. And the politicians need not only be those who stand for elections. I mean, whoever is working in the political field, their work makes it possible for number to be yoked to a sense of legitimacy and claiming something that gets translated eventually into votes. Right? Now, this process is a alchemy that we have not yet figured out fully. Right? Everybody knows that the poor are a vast majority of our country. They have never figured as a real force in politics. They have only figured rhetorically. Right? Why? They are more than any caste group, the poor, if you put them together, right? But why do they not crystallize in political terms? So there is nothing in pure number that will produce a political effect, right? And yet, producing a political effect, the reverse is not true. Producing a political effect may require claiming number. But I am talking about the politics, where politics will need to involve, in my sense, especially if it is about social justice, it will need to involve justice. There will have to be some content given to the term justice, not pure number, which is majoritarianism, right? We are going into that. See, my problem is that, what about small numbers? The census and mechanisms like the census will force us down the path of number when we don't have a strategy for what to do with small numbers. I'm beginning to sense that now. I've been arguing for a class census since 1998. I got so used to being on the wrong side that when it actually happens, I'll probably have a shock. I'll go into a coma. But it's the publication of the Bihar results and what we see around us as majoritarianism in other contexts that is forcing me now to think about, before we are faced with that problem, before we are in that crisis, we should start thinking about, what about small numbers?
Okay. Let's take two academics.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, please go ahead.
Good evening, Professor. My question is, what would it be for Karnataka if at all the caste census is released, given the context that the Lingayat and Vokalinga cutting across party lines are against it, whereas the OBCs and another camp are for it. And what would the reactions be different from that of Bihar? And second part is, how exactly the caste census of Karnataka would really make a difference, given the implementation of such populist schemes in terms of cash incentives and ration, which is transcending beyond social and economic groups.
Only one more. Yeah. There, please.
First of all, thanks Bangalore Collective for organizing such a meeting. The caste in India is not just a classification; it is a way of life. It is not a mere statement and all that. It is linked with their job. It is linked with everything. So that 85, 15 Avarnas and Savarnas did not surprised me. Perhaps 85 maybe a little more. The Brahmin, Kshatriyas and Vaishya forming Savarnas, the others called Avarnas or Dasas and Nasyus in the Vedic term and all that. So after 75 years of republic, we are now are we going to perpetuate this caste system or are we going to abolish the impact of this caste system? And I think the whole process as it is being seen is we are going to perpetuate. And another thing is that certain people are born to rule and all that. In a democracy, what is that? Born to rule and all that. Are we still calling democracy? And the professor said it is electoral democracy. It is electoral dictatorship, or that is a terrorist. I have got many more points, but I linked to this point.
Good evening, Professor. My question is, if you take it in the sense of caste, it is like a kind of identification or like something which people relate to their existence or what they identify themselves with. So my question is, when you actually look into this, when the census takes place, what about those castes which are not inclusive or which are not recognized or which are not taken into account? Because census, since it's not published, like till date it was never published, the census was never published. So we don't know what all castes were being included in a census. So when you link this question with the kind of identification people tend to keep them with the census, what do you think will be the notion of justice in that scenario? Because justice is like very vast, right? So if you take it in this sense, don't you think that it will be very ambiguous even if we take the caste census as a tool?
Okay, we'll come back after this round again.
Alright, let's start with the last one. This has to do with the technical aspects of what a census is. A census, like most surveys, is self-response data. The enumerator comes and asks you something, and the enumerator is required to put down whatever you say. Enumerator cannot decide. That is the theory. In practice, enumerators often decide what your answer should be. With the census, unlike other surveys, your responses in certain contexts might be processed further and might be categorized. So, for example, more than 12,000 religions are returned by people. But these 12,000 religions are worked on by some committees set up by the government, including academics and various people and so on, to rationalize them into the 12 or whatever census finally gives data. Similarly, there are, I've now forgotten the number, many thousands of languages that people say they speak. These are again go through this process. So this happens with the census. And in the past, and most of all, it happens with things like occupation. In India, occupation is easily the most complex category. And yet, the census is able to produce usable information because it is processed later, processed in a rational, publicly discussed, not publicly, at least discussed among those who are supposed to be knowledgeable about it. The same thing can be done with caste. One of the common objections against the caste census is that tens of thousands of castes will be listed. So how will you know? How do you know people are telling the truth? How do you know people are telling the truth about anything in the census? Right? So census is not about producing truth. It is about recording what people want recorded, right? on certain questions. So that in itself is an important exercise. So what you're asking about, it can be done in the sense that the census has the expertise, it has done so in the past in very complex categories, and it has the expertise to be able to, provided it is not sabotaged. And that is what is happening. The census is being sabotaged, like the socioeconomic caste census of 2011 was sabotaged. There is no technical problem. You can count caste, it will lead to usable information.
But the caste census is not a welfare program. It is not a solution to any problem. It is something we have to do. It's like sanitation, right? You have to have sanitation. It's nothing to be proud of, but it's a necessity, right? So like that, you have to have. It's a step we must go through today. And this is related to the previous question. The most common objection to a caste census, apart from it can't be done, is it should not be done because it will perpetuate caste identities. Where has not counting caste for 75 years brought us? So in 2024, there should be no reason to bring up this argument again, right? So we managed to pretend for 7 decades that not counting caste will make it go. Like small children, no? Before they are 2, they believe if they close their eyes, the world has vanished, right? And the world comes back when they open their eyes. That's what they believe. So you believe you close your eyes to caste, caste will vanish. It hasn't vanished, right? So if it hasn't vanished, and if it keeps, as you're right, it is a way of life. If it is a way of life, let us document it. Let us count it.
The way of life has changed in occupation, in many things.
Yes, yes.
But the tag that you are so caste regarding, it is being perpetuated.
Yes, and that tag has consequences. It is not, a sort of consequenceless tag. It's not like this kurta that I can take off and wear something else tomorrow, right? It's a tag that throughout my life has consequences for me and affects my material life chances, whether for good or bad. You mustn't forget the privileges. For example, my last name has brought me incalculable gains throughout my life that I'm not even aware of. Because other people have responded to my last name in ways that I might not even be conscious of. Right? Now, the fact that I'm not conscious and I did not ask for it and so on doesn't make it any less caste. Your or my intentions or attitude towards caste as individuals don't change the social institution. And we have to recognize the social institution and what it is.
I think
so, and you're right, I did call it an electocracy. That's precisely what it is. It's a dictatorship in every other sense, or an authoritarianism in every other sense, except the election. Oh, the first question on what will a caste census do, I'm simply not competent to answer that question. As it so happens, I've lived in different parts of the country, and ironically, I know more about the politics of Bihar today than I know about the politics of Karnataka. I've never lived for a long period in Karnataka, even though my family is from Karnataka. So I'm the wrong person to ask about this as to what will happen in Karnataka. So you should. I myself am trying to learn this. I'm reading the Kannada press with great sort of effort to try and educate myself on this.
okay. Yes. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk. My question may be a little repetitive, but I just wanted to ask, like we have already discussed, these numbers can lead to new calculus. Let's say, for instance, even without the numbers, there are always new combinations forming. Like, say, for instance, in Tamil Nadu, is color marvel, they come to form towers. Like, so these kind of mobilities do happen, right? Like, so if you have the backing of even headcount itself, but also the socioeconomic backgrounds of this caste. Like, I was thinking about your question of small numbers. Like, they may figure out new calculus. Why don't you think we should take that chance? Like, something better might come out of it. Yes. Secondly, I just wanted to ask if you are would you still agree that the annihilation of caste should at least be an end goal at some point, or are you saying that even as an ideal position it should be discussed? Like, it has to be relooked at or something. That's
Okay. Here.
Hi, I'm Abhinav. So you mentioned about EWS reservation and how it goes against the spirit of reservation. So can you clarify that if your idea of social justice is to reduce inequalities, and perhaps economic inequality is the best indicator. So why not include it too?
And fewer.
My understanding from your talk is that the goal of social justice and the caste census as a tool of achieving it. And I mean, what you're saying is basically, I think, questioning the tool as a way of achieving that goal. That you're basically telling us, beware of what you ask for.
Okay.
Okay, I think we'll come back for.
Yes. Are you good? Yeah. Yes. Thank you. I needed to clarify. Okay. Let me start with Sridhar's question, because that is my problem is that the tool is not being recognized as a tool. It is being thought of as the destination. See, whereas I'm thinking of it as a way station or a destination, it is being mistaken as a destination. And people are raising slogans as though it were some program or some benefit would flow from it, right? In a concrete sense. Like you asked for Manrega allocation for your, or some state budget allocation or something. It is not like that. That's my point. So, in a larger sense, let me start with that. Maybe I should have started with this. I said I would start with this, but then I forgot. I said I wouldn't answer the question, will a caste, will a caste census deliver social justice? But the opposite I'm happy to assert, not doing a caste census will not deliver social justice. Double negatives are irritating, so you should work it out, but of that I'm convinced. Not doing a caste census will not lead us anywhere in the direction of social justice. The reverse is not true, that if you do a caste census, you will necessarily get social justice out of it. It is not true. Now, because that is not true, it doesn't mean we shouldn't do a caste census. So, Sridhar, you're being, I think, deliberately provocative. So, I'm responding in the same manner. A caste census is today an inevitability. We have to do it. But we mustn't mistake what we are doing. Okay? We must recognize that we are passing through a process, and that process is relatively open-ended. It's a necessary condition for social justice, but it is far from being a sufficient condition. And by the time we reach the fulfillment of sufficient conditions, a lot may happen. We have to be aware of that. Why not? This should not scare us away from doing the caste census. That's what we have to do. Not doing the caste census benefits the status quo. And if you want the status quo to be the way it is, then you should argue against the caste census. If you believe we can do better than the status quo, you have to have caste census. Leaving open the possibility that it might, lead to things that we did not foresee for you. EWS. Okay, now I've answered this question for the past 30 years, so let me try and do it as clearly as possible. There are many kinds of injustices. Caste injustice was a particularly extreme kind because it meant lifelong, permanent exclusion of particular groups. If left to itself, society would never move away from these exclusions because good people practiced caste exclusion because they felt they ought to, that it was their dharma to practice caste exclusion. Forced exclusion of this kind can only be cured through forced inclusion. Reservation is forced inclusion. Forced inclusion, like reservation, violates the fundamental rights to equality of other people. So it is, if you're a law student, you should know that that is a very big ask. You're passing a law that knowingly violates fundamental rights. So you're asking for a very high threshold, right? So the high threshold is
the documented exclusion that certain groups have been subject to. That is the justification for passing a law that admittedly violates the law of equality. You don't need that for EWS. No caste discrimination is suffered by upper castes. Poor upper castes suffer from economic disadvantages. Economic disadvantages can be addressed through economic means. So have a set of scholarships, particularly for upper caste poor people. You don't want to have reservation because you are not able to cross the threshold of blocking somebody's fundamental right for that because you are not suffering from that kind of discrimination. So by all means do something for poor upper caste, but do it within the frame of the constitution. So address economic disadvantage with economic measures of redressing. Right? That's there. Yes, the first question, you're saying, should we take a chance about small numbers? Yes, that's what I'm also saying. We should take a chance. But nobody talks about small numbers, right? Have you come across anybody talking about small numbers? Lately in the census comes. What will we do about populations that are, 1%? Outside of the religion sphere, outside of in the caste sphere, is anybody talking about small numbers? I think we should start thinking about small numbers. Because we forget that justice and injustice is not a matter of number alone. Right? Obviously, something happens to the injustice when it is happening to a large number. Yes. Yes. But conceptually, injustice is injustice, whether it is happening to one person or whether it is happening to so, by all means, I'm saying we should have a caste census and take a chance with small numbers, but we have to start thinking about it in a way that.
Okay. 1, 2, okay. There, I think. Oh, you missed your chance.
So you said that only not doing caste census will definitely not deliver justice. So what do we need to do along with caste census to ensure social justice? One. Secondly, there are 8 thieves, agnostics, these things people are actually that form the 1%, and there are several reports parents not enrolling their caste for their children. That is also increasing there. I mean, if they don't identify that and if they don't know that their children are not, they are completely unaware of the caste and everything. Now they grow up, but they still are in that system where caste is still prevalent. How will that equation go? And thirdly, that there now the many and fewness that you talked about. The thing is, the arithmetic ultimately decides the political outcome, and for that political right, that's what happening in Marathas, Gujars, Patels. That again a reservation issue came up. Now these are not the people who are historically injustice happened on them, but they are still forcing on based on their majority, their population. They're twisting the hands of the government, and the government is again the slave of the population. They want votes ultimately. So in this case, they are now the social justice as a reservation. It becomes more of an economical phenomenon than a social phenomenon. How do you address that?
Okay, maybe last 2 or 3 questions maximum we can take. So, you want to go still? Anisha and then.
Hi. Just to think about the small numbers question that you're asking about. Well, one of the things that we're seeing in contemporary politics is the.
I think you're too close.
Sorry. To speak to your point about small numbers, the one political entity that is talking about it right now is the dominant party, which stands for Brahminical supremacy and is mobilizing the discontents of existing regional caste politics. And UP is a good example of that, where very small castes have basically a party, a leader, and they have all today kind of, in a way, disproportional representation within this electrocratic logic that you were saying. So, in a way, somebody has identified the problem for small numbers and is addressing it, and they are now being used to buttress. So, a union, a coalition of small number castes are being used to kind of buttress, say the dominant caste politics.
Okay. Yes. Yes. Okay. Yeah, you want to ask?
Good evening, sir. I missed majority part of the lecture, but I still wanted to ask this about caste census in particular. When we see that across the country, the mobilization on the Hindutva identity is so strong and so impactful also, that's something that we cannot deny. And particularly for among OBCs and Dalits in bigger numbers joining the Hindutva sects or Hindutva political groups. Even if the caste census report was to be released, I think we are hoping that upon that evidence or statistics that these groups themselves could pick it up and then run a movement or claim for their rights or something like that. That is the hope. But when you see Dalit movements or any of these movements have become, the movement themselves have become marginalized, or Dalit leaders themselves sold them to saffron parties. So, what do you expect out of this? I mean, I'm not trying to sound nihilistic about it, but is there a genuine hope that you see that others are not able to see? That's the question.
Okay, I think this is the last round. Sridhar, do we close now? Yeah? Maybe one last question if anybody has a burning question, otherwise we close after this. So you can, we can come back. But,
okay, let me start with the last question first. Yes, it is the biggest question we are facing today. I can't see so. Yeah. I agree with you. That's the central question. Perversely, my hope is in caste. That caste is such a strong, ingrained sense of mutual relation. What in the north is called Aukat. Aukat is a inherently relational thing. And an individual on an island doesn't have Aukat. Right? I don't know the equivalent in South Indian languages, so I hope to learn and I'll use that word when that comes. You understand what I'm saying? It's something relational, right? So I believe that there is something fundamental in the upper caste mentality that will not yield genuine space to lower castes. I believe that. I may be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong in one sense, but in another sense, I feel that the success of Hindutva politics so far has been to appear to give space without giving space. And eventually, my belief is that eventually, those being invited in will realize that they are made to sit in the back, that they can't sit in front. And something should happen when that realization comes, right? Now, this would seem like too optimistic, especially when participation in Hindutva politics is active from many of these groups, right? There's a question about how widespread it is, and we don't have an exact sense of it, but it's enough to worry about. So I agree with you, I agree with your concern. In fact, if that happens, if Hindutva has actually revolutionized caste to the point where caste distinctions cease to matter under the umbrella of a Hindu identity, the history of our country will have changed. Your and my story will have changed. And we have to see. I mean, it's still an open-ended question. We have to see what happens. But I agree with you. That is the central question before us. But my own feeling is that caste will defeat him. because it's been around for a few thousand years more than the Hindu identity.
Yeah, that's.
Sorry?
I will talk to myself when I could stop myself to talk to myself. Yeah.
Anisha, small numbers. Yes, but this is aggregation, right? And aggregation is engineering. It's called social engineering, right? And engineering is explicitly social, right? Everybody recognizes that. There is nothing inherent to Musahir or Nisha, good way or that way, right? So the hope is that what is engineered can be re-engineered, right? That is the hope. So I am a great believer in disaggregation, at least from the point of view of social science. Politics is a different game. I don't know enough about it, and I believe Indian politicians are unfairly thought too little of. They are geniuses. Politicians are extremely intelligent people. So I think that this process of fusion and fission you cannot put a full stop to it. Right? That is the nature of politics. So that is where the hope lies. That the more such disaggregated groups crystallize in terms of social awareness, the more difficult it will be to do things independently of material circumstances. Right? So you might read into this the hope of a lapsed Marxist class will reassert itself. I don't know whether it will or will not, but logically it seems harder and harder to pretend that this or that identity matters more than whether I have a job or don't have a job, or who is oppressing me today, and so on, and why are they able to oppress me, and so on. So I'm all for more identities coming up, because that's our hope. It's when we come to, from the airport, one tray, one bag, to one country, one language, one country, one ruler, one country, one party, that is dangerous. The many are our source of hope. They have always been. What do we need to do in addition to a caste census? That was your question from somewhere in the back. Yes. All the things I've been talking about. First of all, don't think of the caste census as a destination. It's so much ingrained in us, we think of it as some kind of solution. It is not a solution. It's a step along the way. And in many ways, it is the start of something rather than the end of something. If we remember that basic fact, if we think of the caste census as a starting point, an open-ended starting point, I think we made a lot of progress. Today, the dominant mindset keeps thinking of the caste census as a result, as the end. And that is very dangerous, because that will be would actually damage us if we actually believe that it's a destination. That's all I think. Thank you very much for your patience.
One question is an answer. One question that you asked about annihilation of caste or
Yes. Sorry. Yes. Something like yours. Yes. No, thank you for reminding me. Otherwise, things get misunderstood. Right? What I'm saying is that we need to seriously examine what annihilation might mean now that we know what we know about caste. At the time when Baba Sahib used that term, he also used it in a rhetorical way, in a passionate way, right? And in fact, that essay which has this title is an exploration of the difficulties of annihilating caste. It's a list of all the reasons why caste will never be annihilated. You can also look at it like that, right? What I'm saying is that whole new dimensions have been added to it by 70 years of politics and what is called development. Right? Somebody asked about, you said about caste versus development. You must think of caste as a primary framework in which our country is organized. Everything else that comes up is filtered through it. So development has been filtered through caste. Right? So the benefits have gone, caste determines the slope. And who is at the bottom receives the most. Right? The stream of development flows most to those, the upper caste who are in the bottom. So it does that. It does that with any external thing that is brought into our. So if we want to annihilate something like that, we have to think clearly about what annihilation might be. Right? And I don't think we have thought enough about that. That's what I'm saying. That to use it as a slogan, to use it as a gesture is well taken and still relevant. But if it is to become a concept, concepts must do some work. Right? They must do some work for us. And I'm not sure what work outside of the sphere of rhetoric, which is also an important sphere in politics. I'm not belittling that. But outside of that sphere, I'm not sure what work the term annihilation is going to do.
Okay, I think we have to close now. Thank you very much, Professor.
I now invite Aishwarya Chandra, who is a faculty at the St. Joseph's Law College, to present the vote of thanks. And I would also, we have placed tea and coffee outside, so you guys can meet outside and discuss for a few minutes. And to those of you who haven't registered with us, I kindly request you all to do so. Yeah.
On behalf of St. Joseph's College of Law and the Law and Development Committee of this college, I would really like to thank Professor Satish Deshpande for being present here today, for taking time out of your